French wanted to get colonies, to get the raw materials, to sell their finished goods, and to spread the Western culture, Western civilization and Christianity among the people of Asia and Africa. Of course, the French undertook some development projects in Vietnam. Let us now come to the development projects undertaken by the French in Vietnam. First of all, they built excellent irrigation canals and drained the Mekong Delta region. Mekong is a river in Vietnam, and the delta region of Mekong, it was highly fertile. So they built a number of irrigation canals to supply water in the Mekong Delta region, and they encouraged the rice cultivation in Mekong Delta region. So rice production increased enormously in Vietnam, and within a short period of time, Vietnam became the third largest exporter of rice in the world. The French also promoted rubber plantations in Vietnam. As you know, Vietnam is very close to the equator. Equatorial conditions are very good for paddy and rubber. So rice and rubber cultivation became important in Vietnam, and these were encouraged by the French. French also built excellent roads in order to provide very good transport facilities. They built a very good railway network, which we call by the name Indo-China Railway Network. It connected northern Vietnam with the southern Vietnam. The final link of this railway network was to a place called Yunnan in China. Later, another link was built to connect Siam. Siam is the old name of Thailand. So the final link was connecting Vietnam with Thailand, and the rail went through the Cambodian capital. So some development measures were undertaken by the French in Vietnam. I already told you, they built irrigation canals and drained the Mekong Delta region, encouraged the rice cultivation. They also encouraged the rubber plantations in Vietnam. They built excellent roads in Vietnam, and Trans-Indo-China Railway Network was also built by the French in Vietnam. Now a doubt arises in our mind. Why did the French take steps to develop Vietnam? Actually, the French came to Vietnam to exploit Vietnam's natural resources. Then why did they take steps to develop Vietnam? It was because of the advice given by a man named Paul Bernard. Paul Bernard was a thinker, a writer, and a policy maker. He asked the French government, why did you make Vietnam your colony? The answer is to make profit. How will you make a profit from Vietnam? The answer is by selling French goods in Vietnam. So if Vietnam is developed, Vietnamese will have more money in their hands, more income, so naturally they will buy more French goods, and the French will be able to make more profit. So Paul Bernard argued that colonies were acquired with the aim of making profits, and only if the colonies were developed, the colony people will be able to buy more French goods, and the French will be able to make a profit. And according to Paul Bernard, three factors were blocking economic growth in Vietnam. One is high population level. Second one is rural indebtedness. Indebtedness means being under debt trap. You know, Vietnamese people, the peasants, borrowed money from the money lenders. They were not able to repay the loan. The interest was heavy, so they were in debt trap. And finally, low agricultural productivity. So these were the three factors which hindered or blocked economic growth in Vietnam according to Paul Bernard. First one is high population level, and the second one is rural indebtedness, and the third one is low agricultural productivity. Agricultural productivity was low, mainly because primitive methods or old methods of cultivation were followed. So he asked the French to introduce land reform measures in Vietnam. You know, Japan introduced the land reform measures in a very effective manner. The similar land reform measures Paul Bernard wanted the French to introduce in Vietnam. But unfortunately, the French government didn't take any step to introduce land reform measures in Vietnam. So landlordism continued to be a very big problem in the village areas. Moreover, the French didn't do anything to industrialize Vietnam. Colonial economy of Vietnam was completely based on rubber plantations and rice cultivation. Industrialization did not take place, and most of the people of Vietnam were indentured laborers in plantations. Who is an indentured laborer? A contract laborer. And a contract was always in favor of the employer. So life of the ordinary people continued to be miserable in Vietnam. The French had a desire to spread the Western culture, Western civilization and Christianity among the people of Vietnam. They thought that education would help them to spread the Western culture in Vietnam. So French wanted to introduce Western education or modern education in Vietnam. They also wanted some educated Vietnamese people to work for them in low-paid government jobs. So French wanted to introduce education in Vietnam because of two reasons. First of all, it would help in spreading Western culture, Western civilization and Christianity in Vietnam. And secondly, it would help them to get some educated Vietnamese to work in low-paid government jobs. But at the same time, the French had some doubts. In fact, the French were in a dilemma. They didn't know whether to introduce education or not to introduce education. They had some fear. Their first fear was the educated Vietnamese people may start questioning French rule. They may oppose French domination. They will understand that the French were exploiting Vietnam, so the educated people may organize struggle against the French domination. Secondly, a very large number of French citizens settled in Vietnam. We call them by the name colons. So who are called colons? The French citizens settled in Vietnam were called colons. Colons had a fear. What was their fear? If the Vietnamese get educated, in future the colons would find it difficult to get government jobs. They will have to compete with the Vietnamese candidates to get government jobs. So colons did not want the Vietnamese to be educated. Government was in a dilemma. Anyway, finally the government decided, okay, let us take the risk. Let us introduce Western education or modern education in Vietnam. But again, there was a confusion. Actually the traditional educational institutions of Vietnam were Chinese educational institutions. Because as you already know, Vietnam was influenced by China. The French did not want the Chinese influence over Vietnam. So they dismantled, they destroyed all the Chinese educational institutions in Vietnam. And they did not want the Chinese language to continue as the language of learning. So a question arose, what should be the medium of education? Whether it should be the Vietnamese language or the French language. Some people argued that French should be the medium of education. French language, French culture and modern sciences should be taught to Vietnamese people so that the Vietnamese will understand that the French culture is superior. Vietnamese will understand that the French rule was a blessing for the Vietnamese, and Vietnamese would understand the French ideals. They would understand the French sentiments and they would support the French rule. Vietnamese will adopt the French culture, French way of living, and Vietnam will become an Asiatic France. By Asiatic France we mean a France in Asia. The Vietnamese will behave like the French, they will follow the French culture, they will speak the French language, so French should be the medium of education according to some people. Some others argued no, mother tongue should be the medium of education. Vietnamese language should be the medium of education in lower classes. In higher classes, French can be the medium. And of course, those who learn French language and French culture and adopt French culture can be given a reward. What is the reward? French citizenship. Anyway, finally the government decided to introduce modern education with the French as the medium of education. So the French introduced modern education in Vietnam. But the system of education introduced by the French in Vietnam had several drawbacks. First of all, education was limited to the elites of Vietnam, rich people of Vietnam, because education was highly expensive. Secondly, the government followed a deliberate policy of failing the students in school final examinations. Not even one-third of the students who wrote the school final examination could pass the exam. Why the government followed such a policy? Why did the government fail most of the students who attended the school final exam? Because the government did not want many Vietnamese to get educated, because the colons would be losing their job opportunities. So to protect the colons, the government followed a policy of deliberately failing the students in school final examination. And the school textbooks were full of false information. You know, the textbooks projected French culture as superior, the Vietnamese as backward people. The textbook stated that the Vietnamese culture was inferior, Vietnamese were not creative, they cannot do anything by their own, they cannot rule by themselves, they are fit only for physical work, manual work, not for any intellectual work, they are only skilled copies, not creative. They can work in the field, they can work in the factories, but they are not able to rule by themselves. So French rule is a blessing for the Vietnamese people. So a lot of false informations were there in the school textbooks. And some schools, for example Tonkin Free School, tried to force the Vietnamese children adopt French lifestyle. Tonkin Free School, it was started in 1907 in order to spread the Western education in Vietnam. Science, hygiene and French were taught in this school. The school taught Western ideas and at the same time compelled the students to follow the Western practices, Western lifestyle and Western culture. For example, those days, by traditions, the Vietnamese used to grow long hair. Even boys and men used to have a long hair. It was a Vietnamese tradition. But in Tonkin Free School, the children were not allowed to grow long hair. They had to get their hair cut short as per the French style. You know, the school authorities called Vietnamese traditions, practices childish and foolish, and asked the children to give up Vietnamese tradition, practices and culture and follow French culture, French traditions and French practices. So by education, the French aimed at spreading their culture, their traditions and their practices and destroying Vietnamese culture, Vietnamese traditions and Vietnamese practices. Now how did the Vietnamese people respond to it? Actually, the students and teachers of Vietnam did not follow the curriculum the textbooks. Sometimes the resistance was silent resistance. Now let us come to an incident which occurred in a school called the Saigon Native Girls School. In Saigon Native Girls School, one fine day, the lesson was going on, the teacher was handling the class, and a new admission girl came to the class. The teacher was a colon lady, and the newly admitted girl was also a colon girl. The teacher was very happy when she saw a new colon girl coming to her class. She invited the girl into the class, and she asked a Vietnamese girl sitting in the first bench to stand up and go to the back bench so that the colon girl can sit in the first bench. The colon teacher wanted to give special consideration for the colon girl. For that, she asked the Vietnamese girl to vacate her place. The Vietnamese girl felt humiliated. She stood up and said, "No ma'am, I will not leave my place. Why should I? In what way she is superior to me? We both are students, we both are equal. Let her sit in the back bench. I will not go to the back bench." The teacher was very angry. Teacher immediately sent the girl out of the class. The matter was reported to the principal. Principal was also a colon lady. She immediately issued a suspension for that Vietnamese girl. So Vietnamese girl was suspended. The news spread to the other classes of the school. The students started protesting against this unjust action of the principal. All those who protested against the principal were also expelled from the school. So several students were sent out of the school. Naturally, the news reached the other schools of the country and protests started everywhere. Everywhere in the country, the students started protesting against the action taken by the teacher and the principal of Saigon Native Girls School. It became a large-scale protest, and finally the government had to interfere. The government issued an order asking the principal to take back the students whom she expelled. The principal had to obey. The students were taken back. But while taking the students back, she made some statements. She said, "You Vietnamese people, you want me to be deported, you want me to be sent out of this country? I will go out of this country only when I am convinced, only when I come to know that Vietnamese people no longer live here in this Cochin China region, this southern China region." What she meant was, she would go out of the country only when all the Vietnamese in that area are finished off, are killed off. She said, religion and anti-colonialism. Vietnamese religious beliefs were a mixture of Buddhism, Confucianism and local practices. The French Christian missionaries criticized the Vietnamese religious beliefs and practices. They had a desire to convert the Vietnamese people into Christianity. So they openly criticized the easygoing attitude of the Vietnamese towards religion. They opposed the teachings of Confucianism, Buddhism and other religious beliefs of the Vietnamese people. Naturally, the Vietnamese felt unhappy. The Confucian scholars of the imperial court became angry with the activities of the missionaries and the French domination. They organized a rebellion, a revolt, which we call by the name Scholars' Revolt. So Scholars' Revolt was organized by the Confucian scholars of the imperial court. It was against the spread of Christianity and also against French colonial domination. The struggle, the Scholars' Revolt was very, very powerful in two provinces, Nabu and Hatien. In these two provinces, thousands of Catholics were killed. Anyway, finally, the Scholars' Revolt the French by using military strength. Now, some religious movements were started in Vietnam by people who claimed that they had a vision of God. Some people claimed that the God Almighty has given them some divine powers and some divine beauty. So such people started some small religious movements in Vietnam. One such movement is called the Hoa Hao movement. Hoa Hao movement was organized by a man named Hung Fu So. A man named Hung Fu So. His followers believed that he had many divine powers. He could perform miracles. Hung Fu So was a great personality. He asked his people not to take alcoholic drinks, not to take opium. He asked them to avoid useless expenditure. He was also against the sale of child brides. You know, those days, young girls were sold to the rich men for money, and the old rich men, they used to marry these young girls. So Hung Fu So was against this practice. He was against the practice of the sale of child brides. He opposed the French domination. Naturally, the French were against him. They called him mad person. They even gave him a name, Mad Bones. They arrested him and put him in a mental asylum. The doctors were asked to give a certificate that Hung Fu So was mad or insane. But actually what had happened was, the doctor who treated Hung Fu So became a follower of Hung Fu So. And finally, the doctors gave a certificate that Hung Fu So is mentally balanced. He is sane. He is not mad. Even then, the French did not leave him. He was again arrested and he was deported. His followers were sent to concentration camps. What is meant by modernization? Vietnamese people or Vietnamese leaders had different ideas regarding modernization. Some people argued that following Western culture, Western traditions and Western practices is modernization. I mean, Westernization is modernization according to some people. Some others argued that no, we have to strengthen Vietnamese culture, Vietnamese tradition, Vietnamese practices, and that will help us to become modern. Anyway, two different groups emerged in Vietnam. One group was led by a nationalist leader named Phan Boi Chau. Phan Boi Chau was a nationalist. He was a Confucian scholar. He believed that Vietnamese should follow Vietnamese culture, Vietnamese traditions and Vietnamese practices. He was strongly against Western culture, Western ideas and Western practices. He founded a revolutionary society in 1903 to fight against colonial domination. He had a meeting with a Chinese philosopher named Liang Qichao. He had a meeting with a Chinese philosopher named Liang Qichao, and under the inspiration or under the influence of Liang Qichao, Phan Boi Chau wrote a book titled The History of the Loss of Vietnam. Actually, in this book, he speaks about two big losses of Vietnam. One, Vietnam lost its freedom. Another one, Vietnam lost its traditional relations with China. So Phan Boi Chau supported Vietnamese culture, Vietnamese traditions and Vietnamese practices, and Phan Boi Chau wanted to fight for the freedom of Vietnam with the help and support of the royal family. That is why he made Prince Condé the head of the Revolutionary Society, which he founded in 1903. So with the help of the royal family, we have to fight for Vietnamese freedom and Vietnamese practices, and Phan Boi Chau wanted the royal family's support and help in Vietnamese struggle for freedom. Another group. This group was led by a man named Phan Chu Trinh. Phan Chu Trinh didn't support the royal family. He did not want the help from royal family. In fact, he wanted Vietnam to become a republic. He opposed French colonial domination, but he supported French ideals like liberty, equality, and fraternity. He criticized the French for not following these great ideals in the colonies. He wanted the French government to take steps to industrialize Vietnam, to develop agriculture in Vietnam, and to develop judicial institutions and educational institutions in Vietnam. So Phan Chu Trinh supported Western culture, Western ideas, Western practices. Of course, he opposed the French colonial domination, and he did not want the help and support of the royal family.